Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Good morning from San Francisco. I'm visiting some of Westchester's partners. I'm Tyler Carey, the Chief Revenue Officer of Westchester Publishing Services. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, well, first off, we're grateful to be the sponsor for today's Summer Summit, but we've been an IPG member for years. We're headquartered in the US. We have offices in the UK and offices in India, and we support about 700 publishers globally with services ranging from content development for educational publishers, editorial for all sorts of publishers, book production, and digital accessibility services. And I'm joined today by Jaimee Biggins from UCL Press, and we're going to be talking about accessibility for all. So I'll get us right into the show. So a big focus of what we wanted to talk about today is just kind of an update, looking from a publisher point of view about accessibility, especially with us now a few years into the EAA and with the backlist date pending in 2030, as well as impacts for ADA Title II. So as a company with a lot of clients in the US, Westchester has a perspective on what a lot of our clients are doing. Due to kind of open updates regarding the legislation, not all U.S. publishers are comfortable talking about their current status. We'll talk about that, in particular ADA Title II and some anonymized case studies. But Jaimee's very generously offered to talk today about what UCL Press has been doing with accessibility throughout their workflow. And so I think this kind of publisher perspective will be very helpful. This is coming right on the eve of course, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is tomorrow. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us just to kind of pull up, look at where we are in our journeys, and talk about different things we can be considering as we, approach our content and ways to make it accessible for all. I'd also mention that, and we'll have the information on a final slide, Simon Mellons, who of course is, one of the IPG experts on accessibility, who speaks frequently on accessibility to IPG and his membership, has an upcoming session that we'll kind of reference at the end. And Simon, as you all know, is exceptional at kind of looking at the legislation, looking at the technology, and looking at practical production workflows and editorial workflows. So that session is kind of like a master class, of things that you should, take away as a next step if you enjoy what you see in today's session. Also grateful to have followed George Walkley's session. I hope many of you attended that. George has been a busy man. He spoke on a webinar with Westchester Publishers Weekly and the BISG yesterday on AI. So, it's great to see so many familiar faces popping up within the IPG Summer Summit event itself. Great. Well, just some housekeeping for those of you who've been online for the day's sessions. I'm sure this will be repetitive, but we just want to make sure everybody knows they're muted. If, as we go along, you have questions you'd like to submit at that moment, feel free to pop them in the chat. If it's an appropriate moment, I'll toss those to myself or Jaimee. And then at the end, we will have live Q&A where you can use the little hand raise icon in Teams there at the top of your screen to raise your hand. And in sequence, we'll be able to have Nikki unmute you so you can ask your question live and we can address it. Then just mute yourself again and we'll get to the next person in the queue. So the agenda, we want to do a little bit of an update on the EAA. I'll talk a little bit about ADA Title II and its impact on non-US as well as US publishers. Jaimee will present on UCL Press's approach to accessibility, and then I'll share some case studies that are anonymized, as well as one that's not, about how some different publishers are approaching this, and actually some opportunities that have come out of this for some publishers in the space. So to kind of reset, I think at this point we're all very familiar with the EAA, the European Accessibility Act. And so I'm laying this out here because it kind of acts as a good cornerstone to look at how the ADA and its revised Title II legislation compares. So the EAA acts as EU legislation that directly affects all manufacturers, publishers, providers of services and products. From a technical standpoint, the EAA allows each country to define its own rules for enforcement. And there are cases where certain countries have codified WCAG 2.1 level A as the requirement, and some have codified WCAG 2.1 level AA as a requirement. And I'm bringing this up here because we'll see how that impacts any decisions you may make about your content and how to make it compliant for ADA Title II that may be different from what you've already addressed for the EAA. Under the EAA, any EU consumer can file a lawsuit. So if a product or service isn't accessible or available to me as a user due to a need that I have, I can file a lawsuit. And so that's how the legislation works in basic principle. Initial lawsuits have been filed, but the emphasis on suits to date have not been about publishers because this applies to every facet of products and services across the EU. As referenced, Simon Mellons has provided many excellent IPG sessions on addressing your front list and back list to get ahead of compliance issues, and also to maintain your reputation in the industry. And I think what Simon does that's really effective is he's able to kind of make things very practical and analytical at the same time, looking at your entire workflow, each stage of it, who's touching the content, whether it's the author, whether it's acquisitions, whether it's production, editorial, production, digital vendors, and where that content goes into the print and distribution supply chain from there. Again, I highly recommend checking out Simon's session for kind of a more wide, wide coverage of this topic. The slides will be available afterwards. I have linked to a 2024 post from SSP's Scholarly Kitchen, which if you don't currently follow that, SSP is a little bit of an analog of ALPSP in the UK. And SSP does have US and UK members. Their focus is very much on journal content and hard academic book content. And they're another resource to look at where they have the Scholarly Kitchen newsletter and other pieces that provide updates and perspectives from other members. So it's just another resource to draw upon in addition to the great information and content that you get from the IPG. ADA Title II. So here's where this is, popped up within the United States, and it has an impact that's kind of almost indirect, which is what's made it a little bit kind of noodly for a lot of our publishing clients. The Americans with Disabilities Act was initially passed in 1990, and under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it focused on access to physical spaces, providing access to people with different challenges, disabilities, requirements. And the way that the ADA was set up initially was to act as a federal law within the US, where we have federal, state, and local municipal laws. And the federal law was set up to act as guardrails so that states couldn't be out of compliance. If somebody has some needs and they live in New York and they move to California, they should still be able to have the same kinds of experiences, was the general concept. Over the time, ADA legislation has been expanded to cover different, requirements and emphasis. And one piece that we'll talk about today is how it works within the classroom, within libraries. On the surface, the ADA is directed at institutions that provide a service. And so there's kind of private institutions where once you're above a certain threshold of revenue, you would have to be compliant with this. So if you own a business, there are some basics such as access to the building that are applied to everybody. But once you are a business of a certain size, there's additional requirements that kick in. The main entities that often, when it comes to content, are kind of under the guardrails here. And again, I'll emphasize, I'm not wearing the proper wig. I'm not a barrister. Did 3 semesters of pre-law, but I'm not an attorney. So you will want to discuss this just like you did the EAA with your attorney. But the principle that a lot of publishers have taken away from the revisions to ADA Title II is that while ADA Title II is directed to content that is available from schools, libraries, and companies over X million in revenue, there is an indirect effect about content that you may sell to schools or libraries or other public institutions. So for you as UK publishers, you're not covered under this piece about a US company making X million dollars in revenue. You're not a school and you're not a library. But if you're selling into the public library market in the US, higher education libraries, schools, there is a requirement under ADA Title II to have the content available to anybody who may need it in a different format. And this is the books. This is an EPUB version of the book, the website content that may be accessed. So if you have an ed tech platform that you deliver along with books that you may sell into schools and libraries, those pieces, anything digital needs to be WCAG 2.1 level AA compliant. The enforcement of Title II was recently announced that the federal government in the states has delayed the enforcement of Title II for a year. According to conversations with Benetech, and again, you might want to talk with your attorneys as well, this window of pushing back the federal enforcement means that the government won't be enforcing this directly on schools and libraries. But like the EAA, ADA Title II allows consumers to file lawsuits. And so if in the intervening year, a parent of a student in a school, for instance, feels that their student does not have access to the adequate version of content, they could still sue under the ADA, even though federal Title II enforcement has been delayed a year. In the U.S. education system, the kind of protected statuses that are often granted are codified in two ways, a 504 and an IEP. And so I'll explain what the numbers in the alphabet soup mean. A 504 is a recommendation that a school district can make about a student, saying that this student has certain needs that aren't accommodated in the current classroom setting, and they may need access to it can be things ranging from counseling. It can be things ranging from additional test prep time. And oftentimes it can be related to content. And so students who may have visual impairments, students affected by neurodivergence, if it affects their reading capabilities, they could be granted a 504 to give them, kind of additional supports to have the same level of learning experience that all the other students have. If a student has a medical diagnosis, and so I have members of my family, for instance, who are affected by this, where they have a medical diagnosis for conditions like ADHD or autism. Under those cases where there's a doctor, it's not just a student's performance and a teacher's analysis, but if a doctor puts forth a diagnosis saying that this student has this condition and needs these supports, the school district is then legally required to provide those supports. And as referenced in this graph here in the link from UsableNet that you can access from the slides, these lawsuits happen all the time. So whether ADA Title II is delayed another year or not, there are regularly thousands of lawsuits from parents concerned that their students don't have access to the right learning opportunities throughout the year. So this is why U.S. publishers are looking at this very carefully, because selling into public library markets, school library markets, and higher education markets, in principle, anybody with needs should have access to content in a format that they can ingest. But there's that further legal requirement that once a student has a 504 or an IEP, they need to be provided that access through the school district or through the library to content in an appropriate format. In this case, in publishing, we're talking about providing an accessible an accessible EPUB, or again, talk to your attorney, but under the read that many publishers have is if they have an accessible PDF product already developed, that would tick the box. It can be an either or, as long as there's a file that the student can use that is fully accessible, that could be used on a reading device, EPUB or PDF. That's the read that many publishers' attorneys have been taking to this. Again, please seek your own legal counsel on this. But that's what's affecting everybody when we're looking in the U.S. right now as to what's changed. In the U.S., everybody's looking at their front list workflow and their backlist towards the EAA, where there's a longer horizon towards 2030 to get the backlist in order. And when the ADA federal enforcement goes in next year in effect for ADA Title II, that's everything. That's the front list and the backlist all at once. So that's a little bit of a change of the game. And you might want to look at what of your content is being sold in the U.S. markets for school libraries, for schools, for higher education libraries, because that's where the risk factor is. And again, talk to your counsel about this, because it is a slightly different read than how the EAA is enforced. So I covered a little bit of this on the previous slide, but both, if you've already been building towards the EAA, I mean, the good news here is that you're doing all the right things. It's not like this is a totally different rubric to work from. If you're building towards WCAG 2.1 AA standards already for the EAA, because that's the standard that a number of countries have set, then you're already on the right path. The EPUB sold into the markets take the same approaches, and EPUB is generally the less expensive path forward. It's the more flexible format. Some distributors will require a web PDF. So you want to look at how you're selling your products into the U.S. market. So if you use some online distributors that only distribute PDFs, and they're selling into the higher ed library market, for instance, then that's an area of exposure. And you might want to look at, which content you're providing in the U.S. and making sure that you have something that's relevant and compatible with the different distribution channels that you're using in the US. The nuances with ADA Title II that come into play really tend to play on the same ideas. Metadata remediation. So if you have older EPUB 2s or EPUB 3s that maybe you exported and didn't update to include accessibility metadata, that's usually a fairly light lift to get the metadata in order and cover that piece. Alt text creation is something that I know Simon has done a phenomenal job on many panels, kind of walking people through the right practices and approaches to generating alt text. And the same kind of rules apply here. Language shift tagging is something that I know not all publishers have been able to get their arms around the same way that they did alt text. And with ADA Title II adhering to WCAG 2.1 AA, language shift tagging is required in cases where non-primary language is used in passages of the content. So the way that a number of publishers that Westchester works with are handling this is they're looking at certainly the workflow for frontlist titles, as they have new books that may have passages of French poetry or diacritics or font changes. That's something where that can generally be handled on frontlist by working with your copy editors, whether they're freelancers, vendors, or kind of a in-house staff. And tagging that is generally pretty simple. There are tags available within most major style guides to allow for tagging when language shifts into another language. The piece that becomes fiddly with this is when we're looking at the backlist. It's really hard when a book's been out for 10 years for you to remember off the top of your head, if you don't have it in your Onyx metadata, that this book has passages of Spanish in chapters 7 and 11 or what it might be. So that's something where publishers are auditing their backlist to the best of their ability. One Westchester client is fairly confident that they have no content in their backlist that has non-English content in it. And so they gave us a piece of metadata that they asked us after discussing with their legal counsel to say something to the effect of, to the press's knowledge, this title has requires no language shifts. Should this be an error, please alert the publisher, because they feel their attorney felt that was a good faith way of addressing it because it's not a common factor within their list. We have other publishers where there's one U.S. University Press, for instance, where they have a lot of content that is in Japanese and Chinese, but it's not using fonts, it's using diacritics. That's enormously challenging for a copy editor to go through and tag each diacritic within the manuscript, especially on a title that's been out and having to go back to the old PDFs or old manuscript. So they've been very consciously picking through the list. They've been trying to look at the series that they publish, and they know they have certain series that often had content that was in Japanese. And so they've been going through their list and trying to triage, in a sense, of saying, here's the titles where if we can get somebody to look at things, or if we can use an AI tool or some other way of approaching it, then we can do the language shift tagging. So fonts are, however, the easier piece. And we have one UK publisher that publishes a lot of content in Sanskrit, where it's English, Sanskrit, English, Sanskrit. If your production shop can generally handle this, if you can tag by font to do the language shift tagging, whenever you switch into the Sanskrit font, that's pretty easy reason to go put that tag up front to say, the language is now Sanskrit, and then at the end of that passage, you put the close tag. And that's something that production shops can generally automate to a degree or set as a standard, process that they can put into place. So there is, EAA drew a light on language shift tagging, but I think due to the duration of having until 2030 on the backlist, there was a lot of runway where people weren't necessarily, tackling it as aggressively as they might have had to if, say, the higher ed market in the States and its ADA Title II requirements are a piece here. So again, I'll move on, and I think we touched on the backlist already that is affected here with ADA Title II, and I'll move on and let Jaimee talk about all the fantastic things that UCL Press is doing to address accessibility within their workflow and their list.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'll start with a brief introduction to UCL Press. So we launched in 2015. We're the UK's first fully open access university press. We celebrated our 10-year anniversary last summer. We publish peer-reviewed academic monographs, edited volumes, journals and textbooks. We publish around 60 books a year, 16 journals, and we have a growing textbook program as well. We cover all academic disciplines. We're particularly strong in the social sciences, history, anthropology, and architecture. And alongside our freely available open access PDFs, we do sell EPUBs commercially and print copies via POD. So here are some of the key stats. So since launch, we've achieved over 20 million book and journal article downloads across 242 countries. We've published over 400 books and over 3,000 journal articles. So these numbers really show the global impact and reach of open access. We believe accessibility is a key part of inclusive publishing. As an open access publisher, we want to reach the widest possible audiences and break down any barriers to our content. Authors can reach a wider readership by following good accessibility guidelines, and accessible publications can benefit from enhanced discoverability. So it's really core to our mission, equity of experience, and everyone having equal access. So how did we start? We developed a roadmap to plot key milestones. We did this around 2023. In 2024, in the run-up to the EA, we targeted key areas such as front list workflow and implementation of alt text image descriptions. We saw increasing author engagement in 2024. We piloted a couple of projects with authors doing their own alt text for their images. EAA came into force June of last year. Since then, we've been ensuring metadata compliance. We've been building networks, for example, with the Publishing Accessibility Action Group, and we've been strengthening our accessibility statement so that it really reflects where we are now. So this was a big one. We tackled front list compliance in the run-up to the EAA. We worked with vendors to ensure our digital content was being produced to the right specs. So we now have an accessible EPUB 3 and an accessible PDF for each and every one of our publications. They are WCAG 2.2 AA compliant. We've incorporated accessibility checks into our workflows, such as ACE by Daisy, and we ensure that metadata includes important accessibility information, and that goes down through the supply chain. So next up was alternative text, alt text. It's a key requirement of accessible digital content. It's now delivered as standard from our authors with their manuscript and artwork. And this is written into their contract. They must provide this unless there's extenuating circumstances. So we also developed alt text author guidance to support authors with this task. We included lots of examples of lots of different types of artwork. And we also have an alt text house style. And generally, authors have been willing to help with this task and have been quite eager to fulfill this requirement. We do have supplier options for complex line artwork or books that are really heavily illustrated, and sometimes we do use suppliers for that task. And just to mention, alt text is copy edited to ensure it is accurate and clear. So we always also had to remember accessibility best practice. So we were already doing a lot of these things. Our books follow a structured text design, logical reading order. We had to remember things like good color contrast, simple tables, avoiding use of color alone to convey meaning. We included accessibility guidance in our author guidelines. And really, it's just thinking about accessibility at all stages. So right from the beginning, writing, typesetting, design, and even our platforms had to be investigated. So addressing the backlist, we developed a remediation plan, which includes a staggered approach. I think many publishers worked in the same way in regards to their backlist. We have prioritized key and relevant titles. We're focusing on EPUB remediation only. We believe EPUBs are the gold standard in accessible publishing. They're reflowable, customizable. So we're partnering with suppliers to remediate our backlist in a staggered way. In the meantime, we're offering an on-demand service on our website should someone require an accessible version that we do not yet have. We have a dedicated accessibility mailbox as well for these inquiries. So in the last 6 months or so, we devoted a lot of time to working on our accessibility statement. We wanted it to really show our commitment to accessibility. So now it details all the formats we publish in, such as web, PDF, EPUB, print copies, and it says the level of accessibility of each of these formats. We also include a roadmap for our future plans, which include the remediation plans. I'm proud to say we've achieved 100% Aspire score for the quality of the information in this statement. So what are the next steps for the press? So further embedding of standards and processes, staying up to date with legislation such as ADA Title II, incorporating language shift tagging into our workflows, exploring AI services for things such as alt text or language shift tagging, continued work on our backlist to really get through that backlist, and continuing to strengthen our knowledge and filter that down through the team and sharing accessibility best practice with everyone on the team. So this quote really just underlines the fact that it's a company-wide issue. Accessibility affects all of us. It affects our authors and everyone working in the publishing company. So what resources do we use? We're really lucky at UCL. We have a digital accessibility team. So I've worked a lot with them. We've joined a number of working groups, and we've also listened to a lot of DAISY webinars. So all of these resources have proved really helpful. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
That was phenomenal, Jaimee. Thank you so much for walking through how UCL is approaching this. I know that you've done a lot of hard work on this, and can show that you've got a very thorough model here that certainly I think other publishers, if they haven't taken all those steps yet, I think those takeaway slides today might be the best part of the show. So thank you very much, Jaimee. I'll share a couple other examples of how some other publishers are approaching this. And again, it was interesting as I worked to put a panel together. I have to give Bridget, Imogen, and Nikki a lot of credit for their patience with me on this. I think since there's a legal gray area right now in the States, the federal enforcement has been delayed a year, but technically any parent could still sue a school district or a library or even make a challenge, that could affect a publisher indirectly. There's a lot of publishers scrambling to kind of accelerate their backlist conversion. And so it was tough getting some people on mic to talk about this, but I do have anonymized case studies. One that's kind of a chimera of two children's publishers that kind of illustrate where children's publishers are addressing things. So first anonymized case study is based on work with a particular university press in the US. So they're affiliated with a private institution, and that's germane here because in the States, publicly associated university presses, like those that might be at a state university, they do tick that box of being a public institution. So, I mean, there's an even higher standard or higher immediacy, I should say, for the U.S. state university presses that don't necessarily affect land grant or private universities as directly, where for publishers like this one, since they're affiliated with a private institution, their main challenge is that higher ed library channel sales are a significant piece of their revenue. They publish a lot of textbooks, they publish a lot of monographs. So knowing that they have to look at their backlist, that's important because public and higher ed library sales are noteworthy revenue for them. So the good news is that in advance of the EAA, this publisher had already analyzed their backlist to the teeth. To look at everything they need to do. They triage things, as many U.S. University presses did to get it in compliance for the EAA. They looked at, kind of the most urgent titles to tackle first. It's a little bit of a different lens that they're now bringing to the titles they haven't completed yet, because since language shift tagging is even more so an emphasis, they're now looking at their series that they support in that regard, because they didn't necessarily prioritize that lens on the backlist remediation when they started for the EAA, because at that time they weren't certain that that was going to be as key a requirement as, say, alt text metadata and all of the fantastic things that Jaimee showed in her slides. One thing that their legal counsel have advised them to do is just keep documenting that, put in a good faith effort that if a title has not yet been made compliant, that there's at least a plan in place to say that this title's in the list for this fiscal year, next fiscal year, whatever it may be, because budgeting for this is a challenge. And as I mentioned earlier, something affecting another university press in the US that I touched on is that the primary distributor that they had for a lot of their higher ed academic content distributes only web PDFs. And so for that publisher, they had to kind of make a lot of business decisions about, do we go back and remediate pieces of the backlist we've already done in accessible EPUB format because we have to provide a web PDF through this particular sales channel? Do we look at the different sales channels we have available? So there's a lot of those kinds of planning discussions that, publishers like this case study one have taken. As I said, I put together kind of a chimera of two different children's publishers for my discussions with them. For children's publishers in the States, there's a substantial revenue stream for the school and public library markets. If you publish children's books, whether they're illustrated children's books, kind of supplemental titles, basal education titles, those are your core markets. They've already been putting practices into place on their front list to accommodate the EAA and ADA Title II. But this publisher, again, kind of a chimera of two, but it's a similar challenge for both. they ran into a snag in that they really delayed a lot of the work on their backlist because they saw that 2030 date several years off, and they just figured, well, let's just start to pick away at that. But then as ADA Title II was defined, they realized, oh no, we've got to hurry. So that's a challenge. Again, everybody's trying to do the right things here, but they're also trying to practically do things within the budget that we have as publishers. If you have a backlist of 30,000 titles, no matter which approach you use or which vendor you use, that's going to be an expensive challenge. So we are at Westchester having a lot more conversations about those backlist kind of projects and trying to find some cost efficiencies for our clients. This isn't going to be Westchester commercial, but we've built out tools on top of Amazon Bedrock using AI to help with more affordable paths for alt text. And we have something coming soon for language shift tagging. We're not the only vendor doing those things. So, talk to your partners, talk to your staff. There may be tools that you can plug in to kind of look at how to handle the backlist as, you're trying to approach this. The challenge, as I mentioned, for children's publishers is that they may even have a little bit more exposure to the school and library piece due to the requirements, or their content may have a risk because the schools and libraries are going to want to be selecting content that they know is going to be compliant for the students that have 504s and IEPs. So it's a business decision that's driving this. So case study 3, a trade publisher in the U.S. A lot of their content's for adult fiction and nonfiction. They do have some children's titles. But so the school library, to an extent, and much more so the public library channel, are fairly significant revenue streams for them. They're not, they're not the large online sellers. They're not the large book chains, but still pretty good chunk of revenue. So there's a incentive here to make sure that they create content, that they have content available that libraries are going to continue to want to buy. If libraries start to use this, and some, may affect some libraries more than others, but they may, to cover their own legal risk, they may start to focus more on content that they know is going to be accessible and remove some of their own legal liability. The good news for this trade publisher is that a lot of their content's one-color trade titles with fairly minimal accessibility needs. I'm picturing a couple of their books in my head, they occasionally have decorative chapter openers. Those are things where the vendor creating the EPUB can just label the image as decorative. They don't need to write alt text if it's just a little kind of curly Q, above the one for chapter 1. But they do have some 4-color and illustrated titles. They have been using some AI-based alt text solutions that they had developed in-house using the Gen AI platform that their CTO and IT department had greenlit that they could use for this purpose. So in their case, they're taking the images and the pages with context, dropping them into Gen AI and generating the alt text. It's fairly time consuming, but again, since only a small portion of their list is like this, that's the approach they've taken. If you have a much more heavily illustrated list, you probably want to look at some more enterprise tools or vendor partnerships to help with that sort of thing. This publisher has struggled with language shift tagging because they do have a lot of content that may have passages in non-English, specifically some of their poetry titles and such. So they've been working pretty closely with editorial. Their copy editors on frontlist titles are all flagging it. And they're just doing their best to kind of go through the backlist and identify which titles they need to make sure they address from a language shift tagging standpoint. So now we get into the ones that are kind of interesting, folks turning this into opportunities. So this one's still anonymized, but it's a children's publisher in the U.S. They've been working in the school and library market for decades. When they saw EAA and ADA Title II start to arrive on the horizon several years back, they took this as an opportunity. They said, we have a lot of illustrated content. We've got a lot of library readers. We've got books that are very meaningful visually, but we want to do the right thing and make sure this content actually is going to do the right things for kids who may need it read aloud to them. So they partnered with other firms too, but they partnered with Westchester in particular for this one imprint that they had to create alternate versions of the EPUBs that address accessibility needs from the WCAG standards, but they also could be repurposed for cases where schools or libraries wanted to provide them on a platform that could allow for audio read-along. And so instead of just dropping, and my son had used audio read-along EPUBs when he was learning to read, this is several years back, the experience with kind of default readers that usually classroom just kind of bolts onto a Google Chromebook or a tablet isn't always great. It's kind of a default monotone voice often. So what this publisher did is they themselves curated a list of different kind of voice avatars within the AI platform that they were using to generate the AI read along. And then they gave Westchester or had to sign up for licenses where we would use this platform, but they would say, okay, you need to use Jane, Doug, Phyllis, whoever they named the avatars as, because they wanted to have specific avatars for specific books. And so they actually use this as a way to generate revenue and make their book stand out a little bit from the competition by saying, still an accessible EPUB 3. We've added an audio layer. If you load it on these devices or these platforms, it's going to read it aloud in a more meaningful way to the kids where they're going to be more engaged. And they did take a lot of effort crafting alt text that was meaningful, because when we're talking about like a higher ed monograph and there's a chart or an image or figure that needs to be described with alt text, we're probably going to write that the alt text caption and the alt text entry differently than for a kid who's really learning to read. They need something more meaningful that kind of really evokes the visual imagery. And so that's something that they really invested a lot of effort into. And from what I understand, it's been successful for them. So if you're in the children's space, there's some creative ways to think about this. The last one's not anonymized. It's a fairly small shop in the U.S. This is a case where there's an award-winning voiceover artist. Chances are that us or many of our kids heard his voice in famous cartoon movies. Richard Riemann, and he, in his stage of his career, saw an opportunity several years back to create more meaningful video and audiobook projects. So he launched a company called the Audiobook Wizard, and he used Westchester. He's used other vendors. We're all kind of part of a larger initiative that he does. So he gets American Sign Language interpretation. He gets ASL interpreters and films them. He gets he himself, as well as some of the voiceover actors he's worked with, they record very meaningful audio read along. He's worked with vendors, including Westchester, to create really meaningful, age appropriate alt text for the images. So if you're reading a child's book and it turns to a picture of a forest, instead of just saying, a forest and there's several trees, there's a really beautiful description that's written of saying, a beautiful forest, where there's, kind of a path running through and a little bear walking along. So it's something that's going to kind of do a better job of putting the image in the kid's head. So again, I got to give Richard credit. He found a niche to help solve a problem for children in need, and he created a product to support that. Again, just a few different ways of thinking about this if you want to take a step back and think more creatively about ways to kind of help people who may need to have accessible content and give them a better experience. So I know we've shared a lot. I know we're the last thing between you and your end of the day celebrations, but are there any questions that you might like to share? Feel free to pop them in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, Nikki can unmute you. You can ask your question vocally, and then we can remute you and answer the question if that would help. And if you're just holding out for Simon Mellon's session in a few weeks, that's okay too. So we'll have a link to that in a moment. So I see Bridget raising her hand.
Yeah, I have a thank you both very much. I mean, that's so informative. Thank you very much. Jaimee, what was the sort of, in this journey, I mean, you started early, but what's the thing that sort of surprised you the most? In terms of, it was going to be easier or harder, or is there one sort of thing that stood out for you?
I think it was very daunting to begin with. And I think author engagement was really surprising. We thought we'd have an uphill struggle with that. And so many of our books are illustrated. So it's quite a thing, to ask authors to do that on top of everything else. But really, they've been very engaged. And I think that's the thing that has surprised me the most.
Brilliant. That's a really good point. Thank you.
So it looked like Mark had a question.
Mark, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. It's more of a comment. Mark McCallum from Code Mantra. It's more of a comment to add to something you were saying, Tyler, than a question, which is that within the US, state laws vary significantly around accessibility. And we've worked previously with California, for example, which has had very, very strict state laws. So anyone who's thinking that they've got a pass until next April to address ADA may find themselves coming up against state law issues when they're trying to sell books or journals into university repositories as an example. So I wouldn't, delay this unnecessarily on remediating your content.
Yeah, no, that's highly accurate, Mark. And I mean, there's a few challenges, but that's one of the challenges here in the States, is that, and it's part of why ADA Title II came about, was to try to codify something that would be enforceable across all states. But yeah, I mean, I live in New York, and New York, similar to California, does have some higher standards for different pieces related to education and content. And the thing I think that it was eye-opening for some of the children's publishers that kind of anonymized that one case study of, because I think they kind of similarly had delayed the rollout until the EAA deadline, but they had all this area of exposure already. Because right now, and the thing is it's not even exposure directly for them. They're not going to get directly sued by a parent, but if they're selling a product into a school or library market, and the school or library decides to audit their content and say we don't have accessible versions of this available, that's something that's a current area of exposure, which is why it's a little difficult getting people on mic in some cases here, but I'm willing to talk about it. But I think especially anything that's serving children is something that, when you look at those examples from UsableNet, there are steadily lawsuits under the ADA already where parents are suing school districts or libraries because their kids don't have access to the content that they need to learn, in a fair and level playing field. So yeah, a very good point.
Right.
Great. Well, any other questions or thoughts? Well, I know what will provoke more questions and thoughts. Coming up, we have on the 18th of June, Simon Mellons will be providing an accessibility and publishing workshop. And I know that if you're on the IPG list, you should be getting emails to sign up for this. But I've had Simon on panels before. Simon does a phenomenal job. Obviously, he's very familiar to the IPG community, having done great work for you over the years. And so I'm sure what he shares will build even more on what Jaimee and I shared here today. Jaimee, I'm exceptionally grateful for everything that you did to kind of give everybody a good practical walkthrough of how UCL approached this. And I think it's fair to say UCL is, staff-wise, not a gigantic publisher. So this is something that you're a similar footprint to many IPG members. And I think
there's 13 of us. Yeah.
So
quite small.
I think that goes to show that this can be done very effectively within any of the operations for any IPG members. And I think what Jaimee and her team at UCL have done can be a great model if you need to kind of revisit how you're approaching things. Well, anything you'd like to add, Bridget or Nikki or Imogen, to close?
No, it just remains for me to say thank you both very much indeed for sharing that wealth of information. I mean, we absolutely love a good case study, and you've given us several. So yeah, thank you all very much indeed, and Tyler, superb job of timekeeping and content and everything involved. And yes, we're very grateful to Westchester for sponsoring today's summit. And obviously we will be sending out a feedback form to everyone, and we really want your feedback and suggestions. And so please, when that email goes out tomorrow, please just take a few minutes to respond. There'll be like 5 questions. But yes, we're grateful to all our speakers. It's been a wonderful day, and we really appreciate everyone giving it their time to be part of it.
Good. Well, thanks for this opportunity, and I'll look forward to seeing you all at the IPG fall. So
yeah, lovely. Bye, everyone.
Bye.